It's been 5 years since the Philippines launched a controversial and bloody war on drugs. Thousands have been killed, and poor communities like this have borne the brunt. COVID-19 didn't stop the killings. In fact, they intensified, according to Human Rights Watch. And in other parts of the world, drug overdose deaths have risen during pandemic lockdowns.
Anguish upon arrival. After nearly 2 years as a domestic worker in Kuwait, Luz Vimindas Yapo came home to a dead son. At their local village hall in 2017, then 19-year-old Raymart Siapo was accused by a disgruntled neighbor of stealing chicken and selling marijuana. He was executed, gunshots to the head, by masked men the next day. His mother learned of his brutal death from afar.
Hindi ko naman kasi akalain na patay na siya eh. Kasi magka-chat pa lang kami nung umaga. Nung nakita ko yung mukha niya, yung dugo yung dito niya, yung mga tenga niya, tapos nakabalot siya doon sa parang walay itim. Doon na yung nag-hysterical akong umiyak. Talagang hindi ko matanggap na yung kamatayan niya, ang bilis-bilis.
It took days before Luz Viminda's employer allowed her to fly home to the Philippines, where President Rodrigo Duterte's controversial war on drugs was in full swing. Since he came to power in 2016, he's publicly threatened to kill drug pushers, thieves, and the people he called do-nothings, threatening to dump their bodies in Manila Bay.
Analysts say the most enduring aspect of his administration, with consequences that would outlive his term, is his war on drugs, which has claimed thousands of lives, both in police operations where officers say they killed suspects in self-defense, and in vigilante-style killings, which were also rampant in Davao City during his terms as city mayor of the southern Philippine city.
Human rights advocates peg the number of killings at nearly 30,000, including those by unidentified gunmen who many witnesses tag as local police. State figures are conservative, but show more than 6,000 have died in anti-drug operations over a 5-year period. Authorities insist the war deals with both the supply and demand sides. Initially, it involved a two-pronged approach, one where law enforcers visited communities, knocked on doors of suspected users, placed their information in a database, and supposedly invited them to surrender for rehabilitation. Across villages, users turned themselves in. The second part involved police operations, which a government circular said was targeting illegal drugs personalities and syndicates. A lot of suspects from urban poor communities ended up dead. A gun and a sachet or two of illegal drugs found in their person, with police officers saying they killed these suspects in self-defense. The thousands killed, whether by vigilantes or police, included people who surrendered for rehabilitation, ending their hopes of turning over a new leaf. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says in its report, guns of the same serial numbers were found in different victims of the Philippines drug war, suggesting a pattern of police planting evidence. Former International Criminal Court prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, before leaving her post, requested for the authority to conduct a preliminary investigation on the drug war killings for possible crimes against humanity. But 5 years since her son's death, Emily Soriano feels her cries for justice have been falling on deaf ears. Her 15-year-old son was not in any drug watch list and was never accused before a government office. Like many casualties of the anti-drug campaign, She insisted the teenager was simply at the wrong place at the wrong time, visiting a friend whose father turned out to be a target.
Kasi hindi ko akalain, anak ko pala yung isang magiging biktima. Ang masama, collateral damage eh. Yun yung masakit dun eh. Nadama yung anak ko sa wala namang kinalaman sa droga.
While the campaign has left thousands dead without a day in court, presidential spokesperson Harry Roque argues Mr. Duterte's popularity is indicative of the drug war's success.
And because of this, ito ata ang dahilan kung bakit kahit anong pinupukol kay Presidente, hindi po bumababa ang trust at saka ang satisfaction rating ng Presidente. So rather than a legacy of notoriety, I think it will be a true legacy of the President na tinutuon niya yung pangako niya na mananalo tayo dito sa gera laban sa pinagbabawal ng droga.
Philippine National Police Chief Guillermo Eleazar, who assumed office this year, vows transparency in investigating cases of errant police officers in the conduct of the drug war.
In my administration, ang gusto ko ipakita dito is dapat walang itago. Hindi tayo nagtatago ng anumang mga impormasyon na we can share or pati rin yung pag-iimbestiga. Basically, investigation cases lalo kung merong allegations of operational lapses. And then, hindi dapat natin paninindigan kung may pagkakamali.
But the dead bodies have long piled up. Loved ones left behind are now seeking accountability from the top. They've asked the International Criminal Court to pursue a full-blown investigation into President Duterte's deadly drug war. But his administration has said it will not cooperate with any investigation. And Mr. Duterte adds that without such a campaign, narco-politics would destroy the Philippines. Words that ring hollow with Luz Viminda, who says her son deserved a proper investigation.
Sinabi lang na nagtitinda siya ng marijuana. Bakit patay? Bakit patay agad? Yun, bulto-bulto pa, milyon-milyon pa nahuli. Pero bakit hindi namatay? Hindi natukhang, hindi sinalvage, hindi pinahirapan. Kami na mga mahihirap, anak namin ang namatay.
Advocates believe due process could have spared the innocent. It could have meant a migrant worker trying her best to provide for her family wouldn't have to come home to the corpse of her teenage son, who has never been charged for any crime.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues to ravage communities across the United States, another less well-known epidemic is taking its toll, killing nearly 1 million people in the last 20 years. Last year alone, 93,000 people died from drug overdose, 70,000 of those from opioid overdose. The opioid crisis has become a national security concern as drug cartels operate distribution hubs in major US cities. The crisis is also taking a socio-economic and human toll, devastating families and communities in every US state. Lauren McGowan is a survivor of the opioid crisis. She suffered from years of mental health challenges, trauma and opioid abuse, including multiple overdoses. After trying many times, she's made it into recovery. She lives with her 2 daughters and husband in Winchester, Virginia, about 1.5 hours drive away from the nation's capital, Washington, D.C.
My opioid addiction started with a legit prescription for pain medicine due to a car accident and then a domestic fight that I had and got injured in. And then basically my insurance ran out one day and it was cut off. That was a track mark right there.
She started using illegal drugs, including heroin, and she then started stealing to support her habit, which landed her in jail. Lauren says she comes from a supportive family and had a good upbringing, but things became too difficult after her high school best friend and her sister died from opioid overdose.
Found out my little sister died from an overdose. And that was pretty much the end of that I just, I went home from her funeral and had my first overdose.
She got to a place where she really thought there was no way she could stop using, and that, like her sister, she would die from overdose.
The last time I overdosed really bad was I was here on this couch, and I woke up a couple blocks from the hospital in the ambulance with my shirt cut open, my bra cut open from, I guess, where they had been doing chest compressions and stuff. I've woken up with all my ribs broken from people giving me CPR.
Lauren's recovery started last year with a program at Friends of Guest House, the largest residential transitional home in Virginia for women who've come out of jail or prison. Executive Director Carrie Galloway says 90% of the women are in recovery from alcohol or drugs, previously crack cocaine, but now opioids. They start using first either after a doctor prescribed them or as a kind of self-medication to deal with unresolved trauma.
Today it's overwhelmingly opioids. It switched, maybe we started seeing a big change 4 or 5 years ago. And I can tell you it's been absolutely devastating. It's really been terrible.
Among the guests at this house is Trina, who's been on and off opioids for 2 decades. She says it's affected her mentally, emotionally, and physically. She's lost her kids, her husband, and her home.
Yeah, 20 years is a very long time. It started off, I hurt my back at work, and then I went to pain management to get it back on track, you know what I'm saying? And I ended up taking opiates for that.
It's so nice to meet you. I'm Karen.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Brian Horisic works at the fire department in Alexandria. He's seen firsthand the devastating impact of opioids on the community, with his teams responding to double the number of suspected overdoses for much of the last year.
With us normally seeing about 10 to 11 calls per month, shortly after the pandemic really kind of kicked in, probably April of 2020, we saw it go up to 18, and then within the next couple months it was up to 20, in those types of things. But then we've had a couple of months where we're back down to 6 and 5.
Near the border between Virginia and West Virginia is a network of highways that stretches all the way from the most southern part of the US in Florida to the Canadian border in the north. And despite some of the stunning views, it's also known for something more sinister, and that's for drug traffickers to bring their goods from south to north. These communities around here also have some of the highest cases of opioid abuse. And in fact, West Virginia has some of the highest numbers of opioid overdose in the country. This state is one of the epicenters of the opioid crisis. In fact, last year alone, 1,200 people died of opioid overdose. That's an average of a person dying every 8 hours. But it's not just West Virginia that's reeling from the opioid crisis. Across the country, increasing drug use has led to declining participation in the workforce from prime-age workers, an increased number of children in foster care, and a concern that pregnant mothers are passing opioid dependency onto their babies. The COVID-19 pandemic has made treating opioid addiction even harder as people are more isolated.
The need to help people to feel connected is really, really important during this time, and we have seen drug use and abuse increase over the last year significantly. But we also need to understand if we have an opioid in our home, it's basically like having a loaded gun.
There are also wider calls for the drug industry to take legal responsibility for all the lives lost. Thousands of lawsuits have been filed across the United States against drug makers, distribution companies, pharmacies, and consulting firms. Most end with a settlement and no claim of liability. But that could all be about to change in Charleston. This court has just finished hearing a case that could set a legal precedence for the opioid crisis in the United States. The judge has to consider whether it was unreasonable for 3 of America's biggest drug companies to ship 81 million opioid pills, roughly, in a 5-year period to just one county of West Virginia that was very hard hit. The prosecution says there's clear evidence the companies are to blame, but the drug companies say it's the responsibility of the doctors who were prescribing the opioids. Cece and Bobby Brown lost their son Ryan at 27 to an opioid overdose 7 years ago. They describe him as a typical kid who played the cello and liked sports.
Ryan was a skateboarder.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, he loved skateboard. I don't know how many skateboard. I still got the skateboard, his last skateboard still hanging in my garage.
When Ryan went to college, he experimented smoking heroin and was given a month-long prescription for opioid painkillers after dental surgery. He battled addiction for 7 years.
He overdosed 3 times before that last fatal overdose. We had detectives that came to the door and told us that he had passed away.
Cece and Bobby Brown advocated for more treatment beds, and in 2017 a new state fund to expand substance abuse programs was named after Ryan. The Browns have also started a community organization to raise awareness about opioids and overdose, calling it Ryan's Hope. They say they've learned that it is possible for families to heal and communities to change despite great suffering. President Joe Biden, whose son Hunter Biden has actually had a lifelong struggle with drug abuse. He campaigned on a $125 billion plan to end the opioid crisis. Now it needs Congress and the administration to prioritize that plan to make sure the opioid crisis doesn't claim any more lives.
He didn't go to it. It came to him. That's how Tim, not his real name, described his first encounter with drugs at the tender age of 12. His friends offered him yaba pills and egged him on to try it. Since then, he continued using drugs, including cannabis. He even moved on to becoming a dealer, partly because he needs more money and also because of the company he keeps, most of whom are supposedly drug dealers and addicts.
เพื่อนนี่แหละพี่เพื่อนแบบชอบแบบพูดใส่เรามั่งเราไม่เหมือนเดิมอะไรอย่างเงี้ยพี่อยากเป็นที่ยอมรับในหมู่เพื่อนด้วยก็ต้องกลับไปวนอยู่จุดเดิมๆครับ
Tim was arrested at the age of 16 and spent a year in juvenile detention. Now he's in drug rehab after getting arrested again recently and will end his program this month. But he admits he's not confident he won't fall back into drugs.
เรากล้าตัดสินใจเรากล้าปฏิเสธครับเราก็จะไม่กลับไปใช้ยาครับแต่ไม่มีความกล้าในจุดนั้นครับ
Tim says it's easy for regular people to get drugs if they want to. And the COVID-19 lockdowns have not put a dent on the trade. In fact, the illicit drug trade has been thriving. In June, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, reported that about 170 tons of methamphetamine, a new record, was seized in the Southeast Asian region last year. That's almost a 20% increase over the amount seized in 2019. The UNODC said the regional synthetic drug trade is concentrated among the Mekong countries like Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Some 70% of the illegal drugs in Southeast Asia was seized in this region.
A lot of police resources have been redeployed due to COVID or work from home because they've had to reduce staff numbers. And at the same time, we've had police getting COVID. So they've been worried about that. So the thing is that the traffickers observe this and just simply accelerate the push. So they traffic more.
Traffickers are accelerating their drug push via more creative platforms, riding on the greater use of social media due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. Increasingly, buyers and sellers are using digital money to get their goods. Although the number of drug cases involving cryptocurrency hasn't been substantial so far, Thailand's drug agency suspects this may become problematic in the near future.
You don't have to declare or disclose your ID, identifications, and that is why it is quite difficult for the law enforcement to do the money trails, to monitoring the financial connections between the criminal and those who behind that.
Recovering addict and dealer, Tim knows only too well the opportunities via chat apps and social media for drug activities.
บางทีเขาไม่ให้เจอหน้าคนที่ซื้อขายด้วยกันด้วยครับแต่ว่าคุยผ่านทางโทรศัพท์เราจะคุยกับเขาได้แค่ครั้งเดียวครับคือครั้งที่เราไปเอา แล้วเบอร์นั้นจะติดต่อไม่ได้จริงเวลาไปเอาเราก็เขาจะบอกจุดอย่างนี้ครับรุ่นพี่อยู่บ้านสั่งเคอรี่มาส่งเลยครับพี่สั่งเคอรี่ครับมาส่งถึงบ้านเลยครับ
But authorities say they're ready to fight against the drug cartels. When drugs like Yaba pills, which are very popular here in Thailand, are confiscated off the streets, it arrives here at this particular lab, broken down into a powder form before being sent to analysis to check on the quality of such drugs. Now, on an annual basis, up to about 20 groups of law enforcement officers, such as police as well as the military, would come around to such a lab to understand as well as to learn the processes of drug analysis. Now, I understand that as drug trafficking trade becomes even more creative these days, the drug office here in Thailand has set up a social media detection unit in order to learn as well as to better understand and observe the kind of crimes that are taking place in the drug world in cyberspace. The UNODC is helping the Thai authorities with training on how to detect illicit drug activities on social media and how to gather evidence for such crimes. And it's important to stay ahead of the curve, UNODC believes, because it doesn't look like the drug trade is dying off anytime soon. In fact, the International Drug Agency expresses concern that the already weak system in Myanmar, a major drug manufacturing hub, will be further exploited due to the country's ongoing political woes.
Our concern is that Myanmar will no longer just be simply a regional production hub at that point, an Asia-Pacific production hub. It may emerge as a global production hub. The implications for this region are dire in a public health sense and a public security sense because the drugs continue to cascade. Right now, drugs produced in Myanmar are found as far away as Korea, as far away as Australia, New Zealand, and literally all the countries within that huge area of Asia-Pacific are flooded with drugs from there.
Last year, at the height of the pandemic, the region saw a record amount of synthetic drugs produced and trafficked. While authorities continue to step up on seizures, UNODC says evidence suggests that the illicit drug trade will unfortunately continue on a growth trajectory next year. So with or without a global pandemic, authorities know that it's crucial they need to continue to keep their eye on the ball.